and this is the Psychology of Men show. With me, as always, is my friend, my colleague, one of the best researchers I know, Dr. Ryan McDermott. How you doing, Ryan?
Good, all right. How are you, Cap?
I'm doing fantastic. So today we're going to touch on a little bit of controversy. First, for the Psychology of Men show, we are going to be talking about the professional practice guidelines for men and boys, which were recently released by the APA. Now, what was happening with this was APA releases professional practice guidelines pretty frequently for a wide range of topics. And it's kind of like the state of research, what's going on in the field right now. But the men and boys guidelines took an interesting twist. So what happened was a lot of right-wing conservative media outlets kind of grabbed onto this thing. And specifically, our friend here, our very own Dr. Ryan McDermott, was actually featured on Fox News. A picture of him actually went up on Fox News showing that he was quoted about these guidelines as this is some kind of like an attack on men or attack on masculinity.
Well, James Bond's masculinity has apparently hit its expiration date. Can you believe it? Get this. The American Psychological Association is now out with new guidelines declaring that, quote, traditional masculinity is harmful. Ryan McDermott, and psychologist at the University of South Alabama, who helped draft these guidelines, asks unironically, what is gender in the 2010s? It's no longer just this male-female binary. If we can change men, we can change the world.
So first, Ryan, I guess I just wanted to check in with you and kind of what your experience of this has been, and did you ever see this pushback coming?
Man, it's been wild. All I can say is that we knew there was going to be some degree of pushback, just because there always is whenever we do anything related to masculinity. My buddy and colleague Joel Wong at Indiana University published a meta-analysis of this conformity to masculine role norms inventory, and really showed that conformity construct was associated with a bunch of bad stuff. And he got hate mail because of that, because it got picked up in the right-wing news media. It was almost identical what's happening here with the men's guidelines. So we knew something was coming, but I got to say, I didn't expect it to hit me personally. That was kind of a shocker for me, and a wake-up call.
Right. Was it weird for you to you specifically were kind of showcased as kind of the face of these guidelines, and you were not like the primary author or the main person on them by any stretch of the imagination. So was that kind of strange for you?
Yeah, it was really weird to see your name on the face on Fox News. I guess I now look at it sort of as a badge of honor. I did something. It was my 15 minutes of pseudo fame, I suppose we could call it.
Yeah.
But you're right, man. I'm not the author of these things at all.
I just like to think that you lived the dream. There's like some little Republicans at home who work their whole life thinking they're hoping someday they can be on Fox News and make their very conservative father proud. And like you lived that dream, Dr. McDermott. So, and I'm just kidding, of course. But okay. So what we want to talk about today is we actually want to address some of the criticism. So I've written down kind of some of the big themes of the criticism that has gone against these guidelines. I'm going to ask Ryan about them. Ryan did work on the guidelines. I did not, just to be clear. I have worked on APA guidelines in general. I haven't worked on these guidelines. So I'm basically going to ask Ryan these questions, or kind of levy these criticisms at him, and he is going to respond, and we're going to have a little discussion about each question. So that's kind of the format of the show. And at the end, we're going to actually do what's called a new segment to the Psychology of Men show, which is what is called our research roundup, which is we're going to talk about a couple of the studies that are recently coming out on masculinity and kind of the implications for them. And Ryan is going to educate me on the stats, because he is the stats king of psychology and is going to tell me what these studies actually mean. So, okay. So Ryan, are you ready?
Let's do it.
Okay. So the first criticism that I would say that has been levied against the guidelines is that this has represented these guidelines and their take on masculinity kind of represents the sissification of American men. that this is some kind of it's kind of like the left coming and taking over psychology, taking over what it is to be a man, and that, to not be completely woke or aware of privilege around masculinity means you're being a bad man, or you're not doing a good job being a man. So what would you say about this kind of this belief that this is like the sissification of American men?
Would you say another way of saying that is like politically correct?
Yeah.
Is it more than that?
I think that's probably true. It's like, this is like if you're not obeying the politically correct rules, you are essentially being a bad male. And because there's a lot of terminology in the guidelines, a lot of work, like talk about privilege, talk about masculinity, toxic forms of masculinity, things like that. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, so I mean, like if you gotta think about the context of when these guidelines came out, it was around the time of the Me Too movement, right? Right. I mean, that's been going on for a while. But the fact is, the guidelines have been in the works for close to 13 years. But the fact is that, I think that we're getting this sissification criticism, or this idea that we're taking away masculinity for ideological or political reasons because of the current political and ideological movement. And it didn't help also that the way it was promoted was kind of using scientific language that confused people. So the idea of traditional masculinity ideology, people just hear traditional masculinity. They don't hear the second part of that. And I believe the exact phrasing was something like, the APA finds that on the whole, traditional masculinity is harmful. I mean, even I took issue with that. That's not right. That's not what we were presenting. But it provided fuel for the fire for all those people who only read the Twitter document and the Twitter feeds and never read the actual document.
So what you're saying is there's a difference between traditional masculinity, like the colloquium term that people would use like on a day-to-day basis, and the scientific term, which is traditional masculinity ideology.
That's right.
Right.
That's exactly.
What would be the difference between that?
Well, so, okay. Traditional masculinity implies that we're talking about sort of all men, right? But traditional masculinity ideology is not saying what men are, it's what men believe they should be.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean? Like, so I can believe that a man should be in positions of power, but am I actually pursuing that? Am I performing my masculinity that way? That's another question.
Mm-hmm. So one is the kind of goal men are striving for, or told to strive for. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
Okay.
It's the stereotypes about what it means to be a man that some men have internalized, and they tend to be kind of old-fashioned, like 1950s or so. So we call them traditional, because if we were to call them toxic, which is another media term that's really popular, though it's also used sometimes in research. It sort of implies that they're always bad, and research has shown pretty conclusively that they're not always bad.
Right. Well, just going back to that, because one of the things is these guidelines are touted as kind of being the latest science. So is there science to actually back up, or research to back up, that traditional masculinity or traditional masculine ideology is somehow harmful or is bad in some way?
Absolutely. 40 years of it, man. 40 years of it. So my work is included in some of that, but I mean, the major people we've drawn from are Ronald Levant. Joel Wong has done a tremendous amount of this work. But basically, what we find is that both correlationally, which is just things related to each other, longitudinally, looking at things over time, so we can see like what causes what, and experimentally, that people who believe in these ideologies and endorse them in a really rigid fashion, they have problems. What we know pretty well from the science over 40 years is that if you rigidly endorse these ideologies so that you're trying to enact them all the time, then that causes problems, because a lot of them are inherently restricted in a lot of contexts. But some contexts, they're really good to be doing this sort of traditional masculinity ideology on a day-to-day basis. The context I talked about in the Monitor report in APA was, like, I've done a lot of work with veterans. Veterans, traditional masculinity ideology saved their lives. But when you come, it's really good to keep your emotions under control in a battlefield. But it's not that good to keep your emotions under control when you come home and you need to express them to your partner. In fact, some of the research that the field has found is that people who have this very strong restrictive emotionality component, they're more likely to get PTSD, and they're also more likely to engage in some really risky behaviors, like drinking too much and self-medicating, and even sometimes can lead to suicide.
Right. And I think that to me is really where I can jump on board with these guidelines, is that it just seems so obvious that if you're a guy and you can't express yourself, or you feel like anytime you express any kind of negative feeling, sadness, anger, whatever, like you feel like you're not allowed to express that, that's obviously going to be bad for you.
Yeah. I mean, it's bad for anybody. So if I'm a woman and I also believe that I can't express my emotions, women can sort of do these things too. It doesn't mean that men are the only ones that can do them, right? Mm-hmm. Then what we find is that when women also highly endorse that and have internalized it, they have the same problems that men do. There's no difference between men and women on this.
Well, I think there is one difference, and that's that men are killing themselves at 4 times the rate that women are.
Right. The outcomes,
so,
of course, are very different.
So there's a lot of ways there's more on the line in a weird way, because men are so much more lethal with suicidality, and we see that, of course, in our veteran population, as well as in our college population. We see it in a lot of different ways. Okay, so let's move on. So what would you say about, and you kind of already started to address this, but that the guidelines are pathologizing masculinity. Like we are saying that to be a man, or to be that traditional Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of guy, is it's not just bad or not helpful, but it's actually a pathology. It's actually almost like a psychological disorder. Like should toxic masculinity be something you can be diagnosed with from the DSM?
Yeah, we don't make that claim at all. I don't think the research would ever support that claim, to be honest. It's not necessarily the masculinity norms or the ideologies that's the problem. It's how you endorse them. That's really that's what we found over and over again, is that when they rigidly when you rigidly adhere to restrictive things, no matter what they are, you restrict your life in really bad ways.
Right. But I think part of it is there's plenty of guys out there who are maybe more traditionally masculine, but are just doing just fine. They have a good job and are going. So why should I believe that there's something wrong with those guys, or that they, that they're doing something wrong when they seem to be the kind of the breadwinner in their family, and they have a good job and they get along with their coworkers, and maybe after work they go grab a beer and go bowling with their friends, and that's just kind of the life that they live.
Oh, that's a really good point, man. I guess I put it this way, that's why context is so important. Those guys are living in a life that allows them to perform those masculinities without any problem. The question is, if they encountered a situation where they had to kind of get out of that man box, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. Could they do it? Now, the research suggests that most guys can do it. I think one of the most interesting things is looking at the effect of, let's say, the norm that you believe you should be successful and powerful and competitive and all these things, right? What happens when you lose your job, right? I mean, so you do work on SES, so I'm sure you know a little bit about SES and masculinity and work meaning, and how important that is to our identity. What we find, though, is that some guys simply say, okay, that sucked, I'm going to move on. Other guys get stuck. They probably, honestly, my opinion is they probably get stuck no matter what. Those guys have some inherent cognitive or psychological things that maybe predispose them to get stuck, right? But those are the guys, though, that tend to rigidly adhere to these masculine roles as well. So there's something going on. We still don't know exactly what it is, but it's definitely a restrictive thing if you are rigid about it.
Mm-hmm. So kind of like being a traditional guy can work out just fine, but if you encounter a situation, such as a job loss. Another one I think about is like, maybe having somebody close to you, like a brother or somebody, pass away, that all of a sudden the kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps or tough it through or like buck up kind of stuff isn't working anymore for some reason.
Right.
That the guys who can shift out of that and do something different tend to be the ones who are successful, the ones who can't, you called it like the man box, who can't shift out of that gear tend to be the ones who struggle.
Right. And what we also know is that men are taught to do these things. That's why the guidelines talk so much about gender role socialization. So like what I'm saying is we set guys up to fail in many ways, because masculinity, ideology, these other pieces of it, we're constantly having as guys to prove that we are manly enough, if you will. And the research is quite clear on this, that if I threaten your masculinity, that's when those ideologies really start to really kick into gear, and I might double down on them. So like, in other words, this is probably gonna piss a lot of people off, but it's what the data would suggest, and I think it's probably why it did piss people off, that a lot of guys who are like the most masculine guys, they're actually pretty insecure.
Right. Well, I don't think that is going to piss too many people off. I think that seems pretty like self-evident. You know what I mean? I think it's kind of known. It's kind of known in the culture that the guy, with the biggest truck has feels the worst about him or has the most to prove or something like that.
Right.
But then I think there's this other class. But hold on, Ryan. I think there's this other class though of people. Maybe when I think about like the Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, or I think about like Joe Rogan, right? Or I think about like Sylvester, maybe not Sylvester Stallone, or like these kind of or even like a lot of hip hop stars, like I think about like Dr. Dre or something. These guys actually are adhering to these traditional masculine stereotypes in a lot of ways, but they're just really successful at them and aren't really struggling.
Well, I think you got me there to a certain extent. I think that not all these things apply to every single person. But what I will say is that do we really know what these people are actually, like their actual psychological backgrounds and things like that? What I mean by insecure is they tend to have had, they come from divorced families. They tend to have a kind of a fragile sense of self. So if I were to give them the same self-esteem assessment over and over again, it tends to be very variable and just some days it's high, some days it's low. It's not consistently low, middle, or high. We don't know. I've never given that study to given that sort of stuff to Joe Rogan or The Rock. Also point out that The Rock though hasn't he been a vocal proponent of sort of like talking about your problems and having like psychological issues, or am I confusing with?
Well, he has, but there's also, it's kind of like he talks out of both sides of his mouth a little bit, right? Because on one hand, he's also like this hyper masculine guy who like Instagram every morning at 4 a.m. is in there like lifting the most absurd weights and like posting this, right? So I mean, yeah, he has, but he's also done that in a very like traditionally masculine way where he kind of just is like, yeah, you just need to talk about it and like move forward. And I was really depressed when I got cut from like I didn't make it into the NFL, which is kind of like the first world problem with masculinity, right? Like you didn't make it into the NFL.
Yeah.
So to me though, I think I'm going to push back on that these guys are secretly insecure, and push back in a different way, that I think there are guys who can just win the masculinity game. Right, like The Rock has like the genetics. He's charismatic as hell. He is a super athlete, right? So he just is really, his body, his mind, how he like learned to be in the world, just really lined up well to adhere to like the kind of stereotypical masculinity, and that's been successful for him. Unfortunately, not all of us are born with amazing Samoan genes that make us insanely powerful and tall and good looking. Some of us are born with, let's say, chubby Italian genes, right?
Or skinny Scottish genes.
Right, and we're not born, and we're not going to be able to, like, I'm never going to bench press 400 pounds in the way he does 10 reps on that, right? So to me, playing that masculine game, even if I work out like crazy, do everything I can. There's a ceiling I'm going to hit. So I have to win the masculine game in other ways, right?
Right.
So I have to be more achieving in my job or academically, or I have to, I have to win. I have to do something else that makes the kind of showcases that I'm a good guy, right? That I'm a good, strong man.
Oh man, I think it's a really cool point. You know, if you think about where do these stereotypes come from, right? Well, so if I take any trait, let's say strength, and I give us a measure of strength to 1,000 people, and then I overlay that between men and women. What I'm going to find is that the normal distribution curves, the curves, are essentially going to be 98% overlapping. But there's 2% or so where they don't overlap. And that's what researchers believe these stereotypes come from, that this is where the idea that men are strong and all this compared to women originated. It's from explaining our world. It's the fact that indeed most men, not most, but some men are stronger than women. Now there's also lots of women who are stronger than me, right? But I am not on that end of the curve. Right. The Rock, man, he's got to be in that 2%, where very few women are stronger than the Rock, I would venture to say. Wouldn't you say?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it seems obvious.
Right. So what I'm saying though is it's not the masculinity. It's not it's not those characteristics that create problems. It's when you rigidly adhere to things in sort of a dangerous way. And the reason I keep going back to the insecurity piece is because it explains why some guys adhere to things in a really rigid way. Think about it this way: if it wasn't important to them at some level, if they weren't getting their sense of self-worth from it, why would they care if someone threatened their masculinity? That's the whole idea of fragile masculinity or precarious manhood or whatever you want to call it. It's where the field is heading now. We've done a lot of work on these ideology norms and things like that, but we're starting to now look at what happens when you experimentally threaten a guy's masculinity. And the research would suggest so far that a lot of guys are doubling down on it, but not all guys. Some guys are immune to it. I bet if you threaten The Rock about his muscles, I doubt he doubles down on it. You know what I mean?
Okay, well, I think and just to keep us moving here, I think another major critique of the guidelines is that they are ideologically written, and that essentially you got these very feminist-oriented male psychologists and female psychologists and people of all gender identities, psychologists together, and they all kind of agreed that masculinity was toxic and we needed to write these guidelines. And the guidelines are written from a very certain political view and maybe are ignoring some science and are not ignoring others. So could you tell us a little bit about the way the guidelines were created? Is that the case where you just have essentially 6 or 7 psychologists sitting in a room kind of deciding these things?
No.
And how do you get in that room? Or is there more to it than in terms of how the guidelines are created?
So there was a core group of people to some degree. I was one of 4 people that were tasked with organizing the guidelines, and that's different than writing them, okay? So basically, we were hired by APA, and they paid us to go on a long weekend in California, run by Fred Rabinowitz, myself, Chris Kilmartin, and Chris Liang. And the 4 of us got together and we took this massive document. I think when we got it, it was 80, 90 pages long. And it was written by about 200 different people. I'm sorry, I backed it up. It had 200, I apologize, my numbers are wrong. It's 200 pages and it was written by 60 authors. I remember now. And it was ridiculous. It was so long. And so what we did in preparing for it is we just read through it and we thought, okay, what are the things, we were chosen because we were sort of on the forefront of science, I suppose, we knew what was going on. It was an honor to me, chosen for me because I was a doctoral student at the time. And they wanted a doctoral student perspective. So anyway, we took that 200-page document and we condensed it down to about 45, 50 pages or so, and then plus references, it came out to be 80 or so. But that's how we.
So 60. Explain the 60 people wrote the document piece.
Right. So there were 60 people you've got your core members of Division 51 who are like the key people in the field, but then there are also people in like medicine and sociology. Like I think even like Michael Kimmel, if I remember right, like contributed something at one point. There's a whole list of them. If you go to the guidelines, that goes over them. But it's not just people in our division; it's all over psychology. But they all were people doing this work to some degree. I will say that we could not find anybody who did like an evolutionary psychology perspective. And looking back at it, I think maybe we didn't look hard enough. So I'll own that criticism for absolutely certain. But for the most part, it's a representation of 40 years of science in the psychology of men.
Right. Okay. So you guys take this document, you consolidate it down. At that point, does it get released? Or what happens? So you guys are making some pretty big decisions at that point of what's getting cut and what's kind of going. But how does it go forward to become like an APA document?
Right, because that was 2010 when we did that.
Yeah.
So then fast forward, it took that long to then get through all the different hurdles of APA. So one of the first things we had to do was. So, I mean, I don't know if our viewers are going to be familiar with the idea of peer review, but basically, as you know, scientists submit things to people and they review it and they give feedback on it. We got that from every committee at APA. So APA has endless number of committees. I know you're on a few, right? And they reviewed the document and they provided a laundry list of things they wanted to have fixed. And we had to respond to each one of those. So in other words, the document has been reviewed by every core part of APA. Then it goes to after those responses are done, and then those committees have signed off on it, which takes a while, as you can imagine, and it's a negotiation. After that happens, then we go on to the public comment period, which I think is a year. Is that right? Does it sound familiar to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a while. I mean, you open it up for a while. I'm not sure if it's a year, but I think what's more important is what the public comment means, which is essentially that anybody, APA, outside of APA, can really like read the document at that point and do some kind of commentary on it.
Right. So most of the APA members are doing this, but we did get a few people who were not members of APA that commented on it. But then we have to respond to all of those. Of course, we don't know who their names are because that's an anonymous commenting. I think it was anyway. So we responded to the APA Council, which then looked at the Committee for Guidelines, I guess it is. I can't remember the name of it. I apologize. It's been a while. But anyway, they look into
COA.
Yes.
No, or COPS. I mean, COPS.
Yes, COPS.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So essentially, I mean, just to speed us up a little bit here, essentially that first commentary piece is to get feedback from everybody.
Right.
So how many
is in a position of leadership?
Right. Okay. So essentially, just to explain some of the insider baseball here, APA is made up of psychologists that are both elected and kind of win positions based on merit. They form what's called the governance, and the governance gets an opportunity to comment on this. The public gets an opportunity to comment on this. And then people within your division, which means the people who study masculinity or masculinities, also get an opportunity to kind of comment on this. So people could essentially look at it, be like, this study's wrong. You screwed this up. Like, you should add something on this. You should take this out. That's kind of what the purpose of that is, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So in other words, this whole ideological kind of thing, I guess I would have to say that the entire APA has that bias then, if it is a bias. I think we should talk about that for a second, Ryan, because I would say that the APA is a little, if you had to guess the political affiliation of the APA, there is a little bit lean to the left. And I don't think that's a lot. It's a lot leaning to the left. We just did a study on this. 85% of clinical and counseling psychologists lean left.
Okay. So I don't think that's a secret. But that's part of the reason why you go through the peer review process, and you go through. So even the most and there definitely are some right-wing psychologists, still get to comment and read and vote and ultimately critique the document before it moves forward.
Yeah.
And everybody's feedback has to be adhered to. There's no such thing as just ignoring feedback on something like this.
Yeah, so there are, what is it, like 5,000 members of the APA? Isn't that, no, that's not correct. It's way more than that. It's like 50,000.
I think it's way more. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, 50,000, sorry. So it was like 50,000 members of APA. And out of that entire group, mind you, they had many, many, many months to comment on this. It was promoted through many different channels, including our own website and through Twitter and such. That basically, we only got 3 comments that are sort of similar to what the criticisms are that we received from the right-wing media. Nothing about the sissification of American men, as you mentioned earlier, but the 3 comments all were like basically saying, like, where is biology in this? You don't mention testosterone. And the reason we don't mention testosterone is because the research on testosterone and these like gender things that we're focusing on is not, it's just not there. You know, at least it's not there to the point where the team decided that the effect sizes were so small, that there was such variability of findings, things like that, that we made the decision not to include it. But looking back at it, I see that as a gap in the literature we need to fill. Like that's part of the process of the guidelines, is not just to inform psychologists about, you know, sort of the aspirational best practices. Remember, these are aspirational guidelines. They're not saying that you have to do these things. It's very clear to point that out. But they also are a go-to for people for our research, you know, and to kind of see what's the state of the literature in our field. And I would say we did that really, really well. And this will be updated about 10 years from now. And in that time, I'm hoping, me especially, will have research on testosterone and how it interacts with environment.
Well, and I would say the other piece of it is that I think is like worthy of note is that these are APA guidelines, and I'm not saying testosterone is outside of that or anything, but our main focus is on like the social construction of the gender, of the idea of masculinity, and how psychology and masculinity intersect with one another. And I don't mean intersect in kind of a intersectionality, magical, multicultural kind of way. I mean literally, when I test masculinity, does that make depression go up? Does that make anxiety go up? Does that make stress go up? Depending on how much you adhere to that masculinity. Right. So if you're really traditionally masculine, and I find a correlation between that and depression, that's what I mean by like an intersection. So I kind of view like our field, not that we shouldn't study testosterone or something like that, but that feels a little bit more medical, and we aren't medical doctors, right? Like we aren't testing serotonin at that level, or dopamine at that level, or any like testosterone or estrogen at that level. Not saying we shouldn't or psychologists can't do that, but I think the bulk of psychology does not like live in that domain. At least, you know, at least where the APA or the state of the field is at this current place. Maybe in 50 years when we have this amazing technology of nanobots who can go in and read how many, you know, molecules of serotonin people have and predict their behavior before they even know it, maybe we'll be there, but right now we're not. We have to we got to do the best we can, right? And that is, you know, looking at correlations, looking at connections, looking at causation, at times doing experiments, right? And not a lot of that is really based on testosterone. You know, there's just not a lot to be said that's like, the more testosterone you have, the more masculine you are, the more masculine you are, the more unhealthy. Like that would be a very unnuanced and like simplistic view of everything.
Right, and the data just doesn't support that. I mean, there's so much within, you know, there's so much variability in testosterone levels. I think there is something to it. I don't want to ignore it completely. I mean, we see higher levels of testosterone in aggressive people who are in prison. That's been pretty well documented. But if I shoot you up with testosterone, I can't make you, the ability to make you more aggressive is very, very limited. Like, in fact, it's like maybe some studies find it, but the majority don't. I did a whole chapter on this for the men's biopsychosocial model of masculinity. But the thing is that I want to point out something here, and that is that there's a deeper kind of meta level criticism that really what people are saying when they say we don't focus on testosterone is what they're saying is that we're ignoring biology in general, you know. And I do agree that psychologists should probably focus on what psychologists do. But we do have the biopsychosocial model that's used quite heavily in psychology. And so I do see some of that. I understand some of that criticism. The problem I think we run into here is that not only is the science kind of weak in terms of conclusive findings, like what you were talking about, we just don't see on any regular basis. But I think the problem we run into here is that we want to be mindful of not excusing men for the problems that men do, like violence and things like that. We don't want to say, oh, boys will just be boys. You know, that it's just inherently biological, especially when the evidence is just not there for that. But I think people who criticize us about the guidelines in this issue, what they really want is they want us to say that there's something hardwired about being a man and a woman. Of course there is. You know, there totally is. But that's not the focus of these guidelines. And my colleague Ryan McKelly had a really nice way of saying this on some news media about this question. He said that when the Department of Health and Human Services or whatever it was put out the guidelines for nutrition, they don't talk about exercise at all. Even though obviously exercise is an important factor of nutrition, right? But it was beyond the scope of those guides for what they were doing. They were going to talk about food. We make it very clear that we're going to focus on gender role socialization because that is what the research is focused on. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's a gap that needs to be filled. I think we need to have more intersectional research looking at how gender role socialization influences biological and so forth and back and forth. I really do. But that's me. And the data is not there yet.
Well, let's move on from that, because there's one other thing I want to get to, and as we're kind of wrapping up here toward the end, right? The other thing that I just wanted to check in with you about and see what you have is one thing I noticed and I have a really big reaction to, and this is outside of the guidelines, maybe this is just how our news is nowadays, is it was very clear to me watching some of the criticism, reading some of the articles, that some of these critics didn't read the guidelines.
Yeah, I know.
Right, and we're misquoting the guidelines, or we're like literally we're saying there was one person I remember, I think it was on the Fox News segment, who was like, if they just had some kind of definitions, like in the document, and like there are literal definitions in the document. Am I right? Like
there are, and people have criticized us about that too, because that's where just in our definitions they said that we're using biased terms such as privilege and things like that. I guess I just don't see those as biased terms, but I hear you, man. I would just tell you that my personal experience about this has been really eye-opening. And I hesitate to say this a little bit, but I'm just going to say it. Every single right-wing media that covered our guidelines covered them incorrectly, and in many ways presented a falsehood about the guidelines, saying that we were either pathologizing men, saying things that we never said. Like, for instance, you can search the document. Traditional toxic masculinity is nowhere in there. Really putting words in our mouth and basing it completely, I am fairly certain, off the Twitter sort of conversations were happening about the guidelines. So that said, every single progressive or even centrist news media outlet covered them correctly. So, maybe I'm naive, maybe both sides are biased. I'm sure they are. And maybe in this case, the truth was just easier to report rather than spinning it for the left or the progressives or the centrists. But it was very concerning to me to see that every single right-wing news outlet was lying. I mean, it was fake news, quite literally. And that's just, it blows my mind that you've got one side. If we take this, extrapolate it to the whole society, you've got a bunch of people living in an echo chamber, and their echo chamber is lying to them all the time. And then you have other people living in reality, and maybe they're getting lied to sometimes, but on the whole, they're getting at least truth half the time, or something. And then you've got the side who's getting lied to saying that our side is the one that's lying.
Right. Well, and I would say, I guess my critique would not be that the right necessarily is lies less or something like that, but more that this whole thing is driven by economic prosperity of clicks. Right?
Yeah.
So there's this thing. It's like if you put a headline as APA is attacking traditional masculinity, right? That's going to get a lot more clicks than APA issues slightly controversial statements in 50-page document.
Yeah.
Right, like you're just not going to get the clicks, right? So part of this is it's sensationalized and it's clickbait, and then people respond to the clickbait. And even going into an article, even if I do click, but I've already been primed to be looking for the controversy. It's like the seeing the clickbait headline changes the way that you read an article. And I've actually experienced a lot of the stuff that pops up on my social media is very left wing, right? And it'll be very sensationalized headlines. I'll click on it and then I'll look for like the controversial thing. But then a lot of times I'm like disappointed in a weird way where I'm like, oh, that's not that controversial. That's like, there's more nuance to that, or that's not exactly what I thought was said. But when I walk away, the thing I still remember is the clickbait headline. Like I don't always remember like the details because I'm just consuming information so quickly. So, to me, that also is a function of this. This is a really clear example of 40 years of scientists sitting in like academic offices and classrooms and doing experiments and running data, and it's being boiled down to this very superficial headline that is essentially designed to make money for the website.
Yeah.
And that's a real shame to me. And we talk about the anti-vaxxers and they're attacking science. That in itself, to me, is the most poisonous thing to science you could possibly have. It's like, here's the accumulation of research. And even if you disagree with the research, like at least look at the data or like look at what the studies are saying, and you can do your own study. Great, critique it. Tell me why that study is awful and why that study lacks external validity into the real world. Great, like do that, and I will be open to your criticism like all day, every day. But when I just see people critiquing like the general feel of something or the article without actually getting into the details, I didn't see any article that I read going into the details of how many hundreds plus studies that are cited and being like, this study is no good, and that's why that research conclusion doesn't make sense. I didn't see that from anybody, and that's what it should be.
They just discount it because they just use this argument. They say it's all ideological based and not science, so therefore I'm just going to discount it completely. That's how it works.
Right, so it's almost like a cognitive bandwidth problem. Like people don't have the space for the nuance or the level of detail that's necessary to critique science, so they end up just kind of doing it at the surface level.
Maybe. I think a lot of people do have that capability. I think that well, we know this. Here's another science piece. I can Google this if you'd like, but it's been replicated a number of times. If I say something, it's incorrect over and over again, eventually you believe it's true.
Right.
So think about all those clicks that you read. Even if you don't read the whole paper, you just see the headline, you're primed for it. It's stuck in your brain. It's like a super highway of misinformation that is very hard to overcome, especially if it fits with your ideologies.
Right.
And the ironic thing about this, Kip, is the people who are most upset about this are the guys that we most need to help generally. Not always. Some of the guys who get upset about this are genuinely doing great, and I'm happy about that. I got a lot of hate mail, and some of the more common ones I got were things like, well, what would you say to my grandpa? He's an honorable man and all these things. He served in World War II and all the, and he's like, from your definition, he sounds like he'd be a terrible person. I wrote back to those people, and I said, no, your grandpa sounds like a wonderful man. And I explained our position, a little bit more carefully.
Taking an anecdotal example, like your grandfather or somebody's father or whatever, and like saying like, oh, that refutes this 40 years of research, right? And that to me is inherently problematic, right? Because a person who's saying something like that is misunderstanding how science works.
Right. Well, that's a good point. I see where you're coming from. I just didn't want it to sound elitist because I feel like the idea that we our elite academic elites is a major barrier to being heard. But
I think there's a big difference. I think there's a big difference between being. I think there's a big difference though between being elitist and actually having an adherence to the truth, right?
Right. But what is truth?
Well, I think truth, for example, is what the data tends to support, right? And there's a little bit of wiggle room in there, in that like you can set up a study in a certain amount of way, but the reason the guidelines are so powerful is because it's not one study.
Right.
It's like hundreds of studies,
right.
like added all together, right? And when you take all of that information together, you end up with some kind of a conclusion.
Right. Like I think it was a Laura Ingraham show that there was a lady who was critiquing us. She was like a blogger or something, and she says, "One thing I really took issue with about this particular study," and that's when I was like, "Oh, what the hell are you talking about? This is not one study." It's exactly right. In many ways, this is a meta-analysis. It's just without the statistical testing to see whether or not there's an average effect. But by the way, that's coming.
But it's kind of like, I think an analogous example is that you hear it often is people will do something like they'll read a study that's like ketamine has been shown to be the better treatment for depression than cognitive behavioral therapy, right? And it'll be in one study that shows up. Well, here's the thing, though, is we have thousands of studies that show that CBT is extremely effective for depression at this point.
Yep.
So one study isn't powerful enough to negate everything else going on this end, right? So you can't just say the singular study. That's not how science works. There could be an error in that study. It could be a weird sample. Unless that study gets replicated hundreds and hundreds of times, it's really not going to make that big of a difference.
So do you think that the right wing is kind of appealing more to this automatic processing without thinking too much, with like the absence of critical thinking, whereas the left and the progressive is also appealing to their audience, which tends to be more critical thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Again, I wouldn't talk in those extreme black and whites about it, like that all the left and all the right. I just think in that instance, I think that that's what I tend to see with critiques of this document, is that people are thinking about a singular example or a singular study and not thinking about the power of collective knowledge over a long period of time.
Yes, exactly. And we have research in there that of course primarily comes from psychology, but we also have research in there that's related to medicine, sociology. I mean, when you keep finding the same thing over and over again, you have to ask yourself, okay, what's going on here? That's one of the things that I was trying to articulate one time about this one person who said that we were just ideologues. And I was thinking, okay, I have this item on a masculinity measure that says boys should not play with dolls. And it's scored on a 1 to 5 scale. And scores on the high end of that are explaining like 30-40% of the variation in another item, which has nothing to do with dolls, but it's if a woman is raped, she was asking for it. How can you explain that? That's data. That's what the data says. I have to explain it as, and I do. I'm very careful not to use causal language in that kind of study. But then I also have another study. Now I'm not me anymore, but some of my colleagues from another university have a study showing that if I prime you with those kinds of norms I was just talking about, that idea that men should not play with dolls, then I'm more likely than a group that was not primed with those norms to then say, you know what, if a woman is raped, yeah, she's probably asking for it. So combine that then with another study where I interview people who have very, strong rape myth ideologies. They believe that women should, shouldn't wear tight skirts and things like that. And we see themes related to this idea of like a biological, like men should stay away from anything related to femininity. We see the same thing again. You just can't ignore data.
And the other thing I think is that ideology in scientific communities has a really hard time standing up unless there's data to support them, right? The only time academics essentially get together is to at conferences to all hang out and talk about research, right? So if every poster, is completely contradictory to the ideology, it gets really hard over time to continue to adhere to ideology day in and day out. And I think what we've seen in psychology is we have a grand tradition of killing off ideologies. So let me give an example, right? Like, we used to all be psychoanalytic, right? Everybody believed in the id and the ego and the superego and how these internal things. And then American psychology, specifically B.F. Skinner and Aaron Beck and others, came along and were like, there's no data to back these things up. This is just kind of like magical and sounds really pretty, and started producing research that contradicted that. Right. And then from there, we got into like Noam Chomsky, for example, coming and critiquing behavioralism. Right. And all of a sudden, this world opens up of cognitive science. Right. Kind of moving from that. So like that killed off pure behavioralism. And we have continued to do that. I mean, it used to be very popular in psychology to have people punch pillows to get their anger out. And then what we discovered is that just made people want to punch things when they were angry. Right. So this whole idea of catharsis, which is essentially get your feelings out through your body, like, which was the foundation of therapy and a foundation of psychoanalysis, all of a sudden fell apart. Right. And there was absolutely people who were like, no, catharsis is real. You're not going to tell me it wasn't. Like, wrote papers contradicting that, wrote problems with the studies. And it didn't matter, because at the end of the day, the data spoke louder.
Well, that's what science is, you know, and I know we are soft science, so I want to own that. But I actually think I think we have to be, because honestly, and this is going to probably piss people off, but I think it's true, psychology is more complicated than anything else. It really is.
I think so too.
I mean, there's if you really think about it, there's so much nested stuff. Like, you know, like your family influenced you, it just goes on and on and on. It's very different than just simply I drop this and it's going to fall every single time. The law of gravity.
Yeah. Well, and I think and I just want to say, like, I want to apologize to the theoretical physicists out there who are like talking about quantum theory. Like, what are you talking about in terms of complication? But here's what I always think of it as. Imagine if every single time you did a chemistry experiment or a physics experiment, the periodic table of elements switched. Right, and how they interact with each other switched around. The same elements are there, and they generally do the same thing, but they're in a different place. Right, all of a sudden the noble gases are a little different. You know, all of a sudden hydrogen has one more electron than it used to have. Right, that's how I've always viewed, like, every person is made out of the same elements, but it's kind of rearranged in a different way, and there's some general rules and themes, but the Yahtzee game, which is your genetics and your nurture and nature, messed it up a little bit. And it's our job in psychology to kind of go, okay, generally when it gets messed up, this is kind of how it goes out, and when there's this pattern, this is kind of how it turns out.
Yeah.
And that, to me, it's a really sophisticated scientific game that we have to play.
Right.
And there's a lot of different ways of doing that. And it's to be expected that we're going to follow some false flags and we're going to make some mistakes on our way to getting to the correct answer, because weird themes are going to emerge that we didn't expect.
Right. And that's why we do these meta-analyses and these kind of large literature reviews that are represented somewhat by the guidelines in the sense of what's the culmination of data showing us, you know. And the reality is that, yes, sometimes psychology theories are wrong, but speaking as a clinician, and I know you're a clinician as well, sometimes they're very right. Mm-hmm. You know, and sometimes it can be really helpful for people to understand themselves if it fits for them.
Right.
And the times that it fits for them are more often than not, in my personal experience. Right. But I want to come back to something you said, Kip, because that was really interesting. The idea that we are sort of, you mentioned that there is like we were talking about liberal bias and that kind of stuff in our profession to a certain extent, and I keep going back to the criticism I keep hearing about this stuff is that, well, because it's all ideologically based, that therefore it's all BS, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, we've done a good job arguing here the fact that it's not, but I want to talk about how it is really quickly. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is the topic part of the show that we should do. But the fact is that it is ideologically based to a certain extent. majority of the people who study this stuff identify as feminists, myself included, pro-feminist anyway. But I'm not a radical feminist, and there are a few of those as well out there. But I'm one of the few researchers who's been looking at positive masculinity ideologies, searching for these positive male role norms, as it was. And the thing is that I've gotten a lot of pushback on that, actually, from people in my own field. They view positive masculinity ideology as, well, it's hard to explain how they view it. Let me just tell you one of the things I heard in response to a Facebook post I put up about the fact that our statistical analyses are suggesting these social norms are positive and are expected of men more than of women. Now, not all of them, but we at least found some. And we're, for the first time, starting to look at the positive aspects of masculinity ideology. And the thing is that this person said, well, I'm sure we could find some positive aspects about being white, but do we really want to go down that road? And I thought that was really interesting. And another person replied back essentially that that for them, social justice is doing research that is socially conscious in the way that just deconstructs gender rather than in any way says that like there's something positive about it. Because inherently, if you are endorsing these masculinity ideologies, what you're really doing is saying you're not a woman. It's like, and so in other words, you're othering one group of people. You're using it's patriarchy. It's keeping women in position of subservience. Right. That is an ideology base that I wasn't even aware of. Even as one of the people who helped, contribute these guidelines and everything, I wasn't aware of that level of ideological pushback to my own work on positive masculinity. I wasn't expecting it.
Well, the other thing, though, I would say that makes it a little different than maybe what you said about like being white or like could we find positive thing, is that there's actually like a huge problem. There's not a huge epidemic of white people not feeling proud of being white or something like that in our world or our culture right now, or like feeling like their whiteness is this huge burden that they, I don't know, maybe there is in terms of white guilt or something like that. That's not what I mean, though. What we do have a problem with is men not seeking help, men dying younger than women by significant margins, men committing suicide at 4 times the rate of women, men not going and getting health care when they need to, men becoming addicted to substances at many times the rate that women are, dying from substances, dying from opioids at way higher rates than women. So there is something unique about the masculinity problem that's worth spending time on and studying and examining, that has real world consequences, where I don't think like studies into why white people are, why the positive aspects of white solves any kind of problem, other than maybe like enjoying some kind of philosophical debate about it or trying to be controversial or something like that. Like, to me, there's no problem to be solved, and I believe science should be practical.
Absolutely, I completely agree.
Right.
That's a great point. I think I was secretly born into, actually, in my other academic life is public health. I absolutely agree. Whenever we write a research paper, I always talk about what's the public health problem. Then, because it's a public health problem, what have researchers done to address it? And then what's the gap in that literature in terms of addressing it? And that's where all my papers have the same format.
Okay. Well, Ryan, I think that's a good place to kind of wrap up at this point. And thanks for addressing some of the questions and the criticisms. So now we're going to start with our brand new segment of the Research Roundup.
Research Roundup.
Yeah, okay. So the first study we're looking at today is a path analysis of racially diverse men's sexual victimization and risk-taking and attitudes by Dr. Brianna French, University of St. Thomas. Really, she's just trying to understand how men who have experienced sexual victimization earlier in their life go on later to maybe have some very sexist or very unhealthy attitudes about relationships and dating. And she's wondering whether or not there might be some racial or differences there between white and black men. And what she found is that men who have been sexually victimized are more likely to be engaging in some sexual risk-taking behavior, and that's what's really explaining some of this very traditional sexist dating attitude ideology that is happening later. So yeah, kind of a cool study. You should check it out. It's in the newest edition of Psychology, Men, and Masculinities. In fact, actually, that's where all of our studies this week in Research Roundup are coming from.
All right. What do we got for the next one, Ryan?
Okay, our second study is called The Phenomenology of Military Sexual Trauma Among Male Veterans. It's by Dr. Lindsay Monteith at the Rocky Mountain Mental Illness Research Education and Clinical Center in Denver, Colorado, at the University of Colorado. Say that 3 times
Ooh,
fast.
that's a fun one. The Rocky Mountain Clinical Research. Oh my
Rocky
gosh,
Mountain.
that's fun to say.
Yeah, that's a long one. Anyway, so I wanted to cover this study because it shows some of the breadth of research we do in the psych of men. This is what's called a phenomenological study, which just means that people were interviewed, and they interviewed, I think, 18 military veterans who had men with a history of sexual trauma in the military. So they have experienced a pretty significant military sexual trauma. And what they were looking at was what are the psychological outcomes of all of that. And really what I'm struck here is that it seems a lot like what concept called moral injury. And moral injury is just this idea that you've really been betrayed by your organization, and the morals you had going into that organization are no longer being upheld, and there's a big discongruence between that. But what I think is also interesting is it sounds like a lot of PTSD symptoms were associated with this. And they also said that they rarely received any support. And they basically just are pointing out that this is a pretty serious problem. We need to know more about it. So they did this really in-depth study using this qualitative method, and check it out. Pretty cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You generally wouldn't think of men in the military being like survivors of sexual trauma. You think of them as being like survivors of car bombs or something like that.
Right.
So it's a really interesting, kind of eye-opening study where you just are examining something that's real, but you wouldn't necessarily know about it unless you were looking at it.
Okay, so since this is our very first research roundup, and since we're talking about the men's guidelines and how toxic masculinity and traditional masculinity are being really, reacted to in the media, I thought we would pick the last study here. It's called In Search of Positive Masculine Role Norms, Testing the Positive Psychology, Positive Masculinity Paradigm. And it's me and you, Kip. So, a little shame.
In the spirit of our own narcissism, we picked our own study for our own episode of the Research Roundup. But it was a lot of work, and we just came out. So to hell with it. We're going to talk about it.
Right. And honestly, I know this study a lot better than the other ones. So, just that too. Okay. So basic idea here is Kip and I were trying to understand, they've been like these gendered social norms, like what are expectations of men? Right. But the way the research literature has been studying them for so long is to look at kind of what are the negative aspects of those things. Well, this doesn't ring true with our clinical experience and what a lot of guys bring to us in the room. So basically, we said, okay, there must be positive norms out there. And in other words, those are things that are socially expected of men more than women, even though women can do them too. But they are also considered positive. So that's what we set out to do. We interviewed people. We did a bunch of statistical analyses with a very large sample of men and women. And we were just asking them, how positive do you think this norm is? And how much do you typically expect it of the men in your life versus the women in your life? And we found some interesting things. We found that 79 of these norms, all but 3 were strongly rated as positive. 32 were expected more of men, and 36 were expected more of women. And where it gets interesting here is that these are all things that people have called positive masculinity in other research. So some of the things that we call positive masculinity are actually just positive femininity. They're expected more of women than of men. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Plus, we do have some support that there are true positive norms out there. Things like being a protector, being, like solving problems for your loved ones, showing that you care through action. Those things are more expected of men than women, but
Right. So just to give an example of that, like what we mean by that is not that men are being like extra feminine or like that's what positive masculinity is. What we mean is that when you ask people who like being a protector, is that important for men? People say yes. But if you ask, is that important for women? People also say yes, it's very important.
But not
And so you end up kind of, say it again?
but not to the same degree.
Right, but not to the same degree. But the fact of the matter is that protector characteristic can both be kind of like the strong man who protects his family and kind of the mama bear who protects her family. Right. So that characteristic, even though it's a positive masculinity characteristic, it's also a positive, like, kind of femininity characteristic. So it's kind of, it overlaps. So it makes the search for the positive masculine paradigm even more dangerous and difficult to figure out.
Right. Like the idea of sacrificing for others was more expected of women than men, even though a lot of times we see this like men are expected to give like the ultimate sacrifice, in terms of like serving their country and that kind of thing. Basically, what we're just trying to show is that these norms, they're all positive, but some of them are more considered for men, some are more considered for women. But we have pretty much only studied the negative norms that are considered for men in the research literature so far. So this is the first attempt to really, get some of that more positive look at it.
The summary of the study, and that wraps up our research roundup.
Research roundup.
Okay. So that's the summary of our study. Check it out in the most current edition of Men and Masculinities. If you have any other comments on the guidelines, thoughts, we'd love to hear them below. Let us know in the comments. If you want more content from the Psychology of Men show, please subscribe, give us a like, get on our notification squad, all that good stuff. So that is it for this week. I am Dr. Kip Pietrantonio. With me,
Dr. Ryan McDermott.
have a great day. Adios.